The following is a podcast of random and not-so-random thoughts strung together for the listener's general amusement. The words spoken by all parties in this podcast are the opinions of the person speaking them unless otherwise stated. Furthermore, these opinions are not the opinions of any organization that these individuals work for currently or have in the past. This podcast is designed for non-profit amusement, and there will be no facts spoken here, except for one. If there are 8 million stories in the naked city, then why does it feel like we've heard it all before? And if I'm bothering you by asking a question here, wasn't it Socrates who taught us that we learn more by asking questions? Failure to acknowledge and abide by the above statements will greatly decrease your enjoyment of this podcast, and we so do hope you enjoy. Flickering Waves. Celebrating the cheesy and twee and the pretentious since 1974, this is Flickering Waves. Welcome to the podcast. This is episode number 6, entitled Femme, Fatale. My name is Terry. If this is your first time, welcome. If this isn't your first time, welcome as well. On here, basically, I discuss whatever music, movies, TV, whatever form of media is striking me at the time, and tonight's episode 6, entitled Femme Fatale, is going to focus around the 1969 film from Ray Dennis Steckler entitled Body Fever. Now, for those of you who don't know who Ray Dennis Steckler is and want a extensive introduction, I wrote a piece on the Forgotten Flicks website, that is forgottenflickswithanx.com. And I will try to give you some highlights as we go along, but if you want to know more to get started, that would be the place to go. If you were to read that article before listening to this particular podcast, you might wonder why I am picking a film like Body Fever and not taking this as an opportunity to discuss a more well-known film of his like The Thrill Killers or The Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living Became Mixed Up Zombies. And that is a good question. The answer to that is, I feel with Body Fever, he being Ray Dennis Steckler, does not engage in the what can be a drawback for people who like more traditional films, more traditional narratives. He doesn't do the genre mashups, hybrid, whatever you want to call it, like he does in Thrill Killers and Incredibly Strange Creatures. Body Fever is a very straightforward narrative. Well, I take that back. It's not the most straightforward narrative, I suppose, in the world of film noir, which is what he is trying to do with this film. It's quite standard, but the thing that I most noticed as I sat down to actively watch this movie for the podcast is that the plot of this film is a bit convoluted. Convoluted would imply that it's hard to follow, and it's not. It's just that for a film like this, there's just seemingly a lot of characters, and like a good film noir, there's this very twisted web that gets created very early on in the movie and just kind of unravels as the movie progresses. Again, something typical of a film noir, but not the madcap mashup. Rat Finka Boo Boo is, a superhero movie that doesn't really introduce itself as that until nearly the halfway mark. The first half of that film is, a very, almost like a straightforward suspense thriller, and then almost as quickly as you can snap your fingers, it just becomes this other thing. Incredibly Strange Creatures, you've got this monster movie and this musical. Even Steckler himself thought of it as a musical mashed up with Rebel Without a Cause and Black Orpheus. Body Fever is probably in terms of narrative, one of the easier films in the Ray Dennis Steckler catalog to swallow. Now, it does have some of the unique quirks that Steckler fans like that people unfamiliar with this work might be turned off by, but those are the things that make Steckler's films and not, I mean, even amongst other B-movie directors. I think rather than going too much further here, I'm going to go ahead and let you guys listen to a trailer of this. I wasn't going to use this initially and actually took the last 15-20 seconds of the audio off, but now having time to sit with it and everything like that, as an audio clip, I think it sells the movie fairly well. If you were to see the video that is with it, it's a little bit more of a mess. This was actually something that Media Blasters, the company who put out the DVD, put together because there was no real proper trailer for the film. It did have a theatrical run, but it was very limited. It ended up on a double bill, and it was a very strange double bill. If I remember, I might come back and discuss that briefly. But as a result, I think one of the things that has made this film hard to get to even for Steckler fans is even though it is this very standard film noir, it was put out in a time where film noir wasn't really in vogue. I mean, if this would have been, 20 years earlier or even 5-10 years later, it would have been more in the public consciousness. But in the late 60s, the film noir as a genre was not really something that was bandied about as something to do. But as Steckler has proven over the years, his favorite genres of film, like the Western and silent films, were definitely not in vogue when he himself was making films, but he found himself calling back to those genres of films because they're honestly the genres that he loved. So before I rattle on too much more, let me go ahead and throw you guys over to the trailer. We'll come back and we'll set up a proper synopsis and we'll go on from there. So here's the trailer for Body Fever.
Ferguson, if this is some kind of a joke, I'm not laughing. No, you listen to me, you imbecile. Are you telling me some girl went in there and stole that stuff from under your nose? As far as I'm concerned, Ferguson, you're dead.
I'm looking for a Mr. Charles Smith.
I'm Charlie Smith. Who are you?
Harris Ferguson.
You find Ferguson and kill him. You kill him good.
What's so important that you want to spend $3,000 to find her?
Her name is Carrie Erskine. You may call me at this number when you find her, and only then.
I didn't say I was going to do it.
You have exactly 3 days.
Where's the stuff?
I don't have it.
What do you mean you don't have it? You gotta have it.
Sorry, somebody stole it.
And what are you trying to pull? I'm actually looking for Carrie Erskine. I was told you might know where I could find her.
I don't know anybody by that name.
Give me my case.
What do I have to do?
You double-crosser! You lied to me! But a pistol back!
All right, now pull your head off.
Do that to me? To me?
Say goodbye, Brett.
Carrie.
Goodbye, Brett.
If after listening to that trailer you are interested in seeking out a copy of this film, if you're just looking for a copy to stream, you can go to Fandor.com. That's Fandor.com. You can get a 2-week trial there. You can check out the cult films, like the films of Ray Dennis Steckler. You can check out independent fare, like the new film from Hal Hartley. And there's foreign films, documentaries, a lot of films that play film festivals, but then kind of quietly disappear after that. That's the kind of movies that you'll find at Fandor.com. If you're looking for a rental copy, you might be able to get a DVD rental of it through Netflix. Otherwise, it's not really that expensive to buy. You can go to Amazon, eBay, any bigger websites like that will more than likely have a copy or 2 or 10 available of it, and you can check it out that way. Just a friendly warning up front. I'm going to try my best not to spoil this movie, but given the fact that I am trying to talk about the movie, certain aspects of the plot will be discussed, and if you're not wanting to find out about those things, it would be best to stop the podcast right now, go check the movie out, and then pick back up once you're done. The movie Body Fever opens up with a woman approaching a locked safe. As she unlocks the safe, a brown leather bag is revealed. And as it appears the woman is going to be making a getaway, she is attacked. She's attacked by a man. And in that altercation, the man ends up getting away with the brown leather bag, leaving a woman's plans for a different life left in question. Cut to Charlie Smith, played by the director, Ray Dennis Steckler. He is a down-on-his-luck detective looking for his next job when a Mr. Ferguson approaches him about a 3-day job. 3 days, $3,000. The goal? To find one Carrie Erskine, played by Ray Dennis Steckler's then-wife, Carolyn Brandt. We're introduced early on to one Big Mac, played by co-creator of Hogan's Heroes, Bernard Fine. Clearly, this brown leather bag was something of Big Mac's, and he wants it back. So while his forces are converging on Ferguson and Carrie Erskine, Charlie Smith's left in the middle trying to find Carrie and make sense of all of this. As with any good film noir, this film has its share of twists and turns, femme fatales, just generally speaking, women who are looking to distract Charlie and men who are looking to antagonize Charlie Smith. But Charlie Smith has one clear goal, and that is of one Carrie Erskine, and it is in that journey that he is in now, and it's the result of said journey that will lead us to the conclusion of Body Fever. And if that sounded a little bit too much like a detective voiceover in a film noir film, that was kind of intentional, as is often the case of film noir films, and it's definitely the case of Body Fever. We do have some very memorable, at least for me, memorable voiceover from Ray Dennis Steckler in the role of Charlie Smith. I think this might be a good time to cut to a clip of that right here. So let's take a listen.
The man said, "You play it your way, I'll play it mine." That's some genuine, impartial advice from the real pro in this game. I mean, my whole life has been a movie, but I keep getting the reels mixed up. Just look what we've managed to do here already. So Charlie's made up his mind. He's either going to pull through or pull out. It's with today that I wrestle now, and I'm not alone. Charlie Smith is not alone today.
That little bit of voiceover ends up setting up the next scene, which takes place at a laundromat, but very quickly I'll make quick reference and set the scene that was in that audio clip, which was basically Charlie Smith making his way to the laundromat and stopping by a local movie theater. And then the real pro that he was referring to, as shown in various pictures at the theater, was Humphrey Bogart. Certainly thinking of The Big Sleep and The Maltese Falcon. But back to the scene at the laundromat, which actually is probably one of my favorite scenes in the movie. My love for this next scene may be as much, if not more so, for the story behind the scenes than what actually takes place on screen. Charlie Smith ends up going to this laundromat and meeting Coley, played by director Coleman Francis. Beast of Yucca Flats is probably the film he's most famous or infamous for, depending on how you want to slice it. In this scene, this is also ties back into that piece of dialogue. That's the reason why he's not alone. Coley turns out to be the one true blue friend that he has in this whole movie, that are consistently through. We could refer back to the beginning of the film and his secretary Stella, but she figures less and less into the story as the story moves along. But anyways, meeting up with Coley, and the reason why he's there is to actually close up the laundromat, and this little scene plays out as to why he's doing it, and it's kind of sad, but this was not originally what Ray Dennis Steckler planned for this scene. As it turned out, the night before they were going to shoot this next segment of the movie, Ray and a friend of his ended up finding Coleman Francis. He was, from what I understand, a little intoxicated and just looked horrible. It looked like he was homeless, essentially. And Ray approached him and offered him $20 and told him to be back at this particular spot, like 9 o'clock the next morning. Ray and the crew got together the next day, was getting ready to shoot. And what Ray was hoping Coleman would do with the $20 was just, get a nice room, sleep off the night, be ready to go the next morning. Instead of getting a room for the night, Coleman decided to not get that room and stay out, as he presumably had been up to this point. He took the $20, waited until the next morning where he was able to get a shave and a shower and still enough money to buy an outfit that he was going to wear as this character that Coleman had come up with overnight before heading to the set. And Ray was hoping for a more destitute, homeless type look and had one scene in mind. But when this happened, Ray quickly changed the scene and set up this scene in the laundromat with him running it. And later in the second act, this conversation between the two of them, and it's to see Ray and Coleman interact. There's moments where you sit there and kind of get a sense that the things being said are more than just the conversations between Coley and Charlie, but actually things might have been said before the cameras rolled, or things that they were wanting to say but just hadn't. It's a very nice little scene, and like I said, those two moments together, the scene outside the movie theater and the laundromat, is probably one of my favorite parts of the movie. I love that little voiceover quote from Charlie talking about how his life is like a movie, but the reel's all mixed up. It's something that I've come back to a few times over the years. Another scene that's a particular favorite, and I think I'm going to just talk about one or two more scenes here before I switch this on over more to a discussion of a little more analysis and trivia type stuff. I'm just trying to get you guys a taste of this. Hopefully I tell you guys enough to make you want to go and seek this out like I did so many years ago. It was a film that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed a lot of I would say universally, the 60s Ray Dennis Steckler films I've enjoyed in varying levels, but this one in recent years just seems to be one I keep going back to more and more. Maybe because I haven't watched it as much as some of his other stuff, but I think there might be something a little more in it that I'm enjoying as well. But the other scene that I wanted to bring up is a scene between, actually, it's the first time that Charlie and Carrie first meet. We're going to take a moment and we'll give you guys a little snippet of that.
Come in. Ferguson sent you, didn't he?
Say, who's the real detective here?
Why does he want me?
He didn't say.
As simple as that.
That's the way it goes in my business.
How would you like to earn $75,000?
Oh, that would be nice. Oh, 75,000. What do I have to do?
Now, one thing that struck me when I was watching it this particular time, and I love the Henry Price score in this film, goes by the name of Andre Bremer as well. Outside of the contributions from Don Snyder, does a couple themes in this film, and he does some songs in the Lemon Grove Kids and the Ron Haydock material that's in Rat Finga Boo Boo. Henry Price is essential to, in my opinion, to what makes Ray Dennis Steckler films so good as far as composers of B-movie music. I'm hard-pressed to think of anybody who does it better, and certainly would be open to someone enlightening me on this. It's just these films from the 60s, Rat Fink, Incredibly Strange Creatures, Thrill Killers. I dare say that the Henry Price scores removed from these movies would almost render them unwatchable. There's some great visuals in these films, don't get me wrong, and certainly a lot of these movies work as silent films, but the scores that he does add so much to these movies. And you're going to get some snippets here, but there's some really good stuff throughout this movie. It's probably one of the better scores in a perfect world. I mean, we do have, a CD of all the Arch Hall Jr.'s stuff, which, Ray directed him in Wild Guitar. The Ron Haydock stuff's now readily available. I would love it if somebody would be able to somehow go and get these scores and put together. It would probably make sense to just go ahead and do it as a 2 or 3 CD box set, because I think if you distill the scores down, they're probably too short to just do a single disc. And I would imagine anybody who would be interested in getting one score would probably just want to get the whole lot of them. And he's done some other scores for other directors. I think Russ Meyer is probably the biggest name that I saw amongst his listings, but I would think the Steckler stuff would stand alone on it as a nice little box set. But that's a whole nother discussion for another time. But now that I've made this huge declaration of how much I love the score, I did not realize how weird it was to see Carrie dancing the way she does during that music. And I totally understand that you're not getting that from listening to an audio clip, but rest assured, when you see that, it looks like some weird form of interpretive dance. Now, I'm a fan of Carolyn Brandt. I think this may be her best film, if only because she's actually allowed to be in the film the whole way through. Many of the other films that she's done, her role's been a little more diminished. Incredibly Strange Creatures immediately comes to mind. She's out of the movie within like the first 20-25 minutes. But the fact that she's kind of given this a role that actually plays through all 3 acts of the story. And unlike Rat Fink, where she plays more of a damsel in distress, I wouldn't necessarily say she's a female hero role model, like feminist type thing that goes on here. But I do think that she definitely stands up for herself, and she definitely plays within the Femme Fatale archetype, but not necessarily in the way that you saw it play out in the heyday of film noir. We know she's capable of being dangerous, but we also know, I certainly did, and most people find out very quickly, the fact that they were husband and wife at the time, so you kind of get a good sense of how things are going to play out. But again, I found the score and her dancing a very weird little combination, and as that being their initial encounter, and I don't think it was strictly the possibility of cashing in on $150,000, as she very quickly offers Charlie the opportunity to have a cut of that. Their chemistry really kicks in fairly quick, and after an encounter that conveniently forces them to send the one outfit that they have to the cleaners, they are left in a hotel room with no clothes. So naturally, what a consenting couple is willing to do in a hotel room very tastefully transpires. And that's one of the things, and certainly this was very much Steckler's thing. I think in other people's hands, this film could have been more graphic in its sex, in its violence, in the drug use that does come into play here, because we are dealing with $150,000 of uncut heroin. There is a dealer involved in all this, and you do see some of that stuff, but it's very low key, and it's all about suggesting, not actually spelling it out for you. And one of the flourishes that Steckler did in a lot of his films of this period, Rat Fink's probably the best example as far as really playing with colors. Everything in Rat Finks was all about tints, color tints. And in this, he has the one moment, but I find it really weird because I don't know if it was in his attempt at an O face for Carrie's character, but the scene's playing out and it comes to an end where she appears to be enjoying what has happened, and then the screen kind of turns this reddish orange, and then we're on to the next scene. That's the one instance that he uses that here. Most of the time the film's, as far as the use of color goes, it's very more what is actually in the setting, whether it be on the few location shots that they have, or as he's shooting around his house. The colors and the lighting that you have there is pretty much what he records in the camera. There's not a whole lot of tricks, as it were. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and take us out of this segment, and then I'm going to go a little bit more in behind the scenes, and also talk about, when it comes to Ray Dennis Steckler and people thinking of other people associated with him, they usually think of Wilmo Sigmund and Laszlo Kovacs, who were involved with the Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living Became Mixed Up Zombies. But I'm going to introduce a few other names that you, if you're one of those people who look past actors and directors, a few other names you might be intrigued to know about. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Flickering Waves. We're continuing our discussion of the 1969 Ray Dennis Steckler film, Body Fever. Now, I know I've mentioned earlier in the podcast some of the things that make Ray Dennis Steckler, and how those things were a bit suppressed in this film. He does still manage to pull off a few of those things, and they're probably more production-based, but just kind of, this is the way he's made his films. Wild Guitar is kind of its own thing because, it was an Arch Hall Jr. vehicle, with Arch Hall Sr. being the producer behind it. So once he got away from that and certainly the later films, as the budget started getting less and less. I mean, Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living became Mixed Up Zombies, and yes, I do love saying that title, was probably his most expensive film, and he made it for the massive, humongous sum of $38,000, which I think even if you were to adjust that figure for inflation today is still a remarkably low amount for a film budget. You know, probably what most Hollywood blockbusters spend for catering in just, you know, a couple days. But one of the things that Ray always did in those later films is that he would film a lot of his stuff, and Body Fever especially, a lot of it is filmed inside his house. You will find that once you see, he does a good job of hiding it at some points, like even listening to the commentary and finding out that certain scenes were shot in his cellar. It's kind of still a little surprising. He manages to do just enough in set design to make it a little different. So if you see the cellar, even at different points within this movie, and then look at something like the Lemon Grove Kids, which was also a lot of those were shot in the house's cellar, and you can see some things that tip it off, but for the most part, he does a pretty good job of hiding things, and you know, doing simple little tricks like it seems so slight in doing it, but for the scene that ends up introducing us fully to Carrie when Charlie meets her for the first time, all he ended up doing for that was just putting stick-on numbers to the doors, and it was just enough to sell it. I mean, and that certainly is not a very expensive thing to pull off. And, you know, take stuff out of one room and, you know, create the mood or scene that you're trying to set up there, put it back in there. I mean, the scene where they do meet, I guess, was one of their daughter's bedrooms that they ended up repurposing for a short period of time to, you know, pull this particular scene off. Consistently, he has, and that was one thing that gave him enjoyment. And I guess going back to one of the things that I read about in this like 30-word review for the Thrill Killers, you know, they wrote it off as pretentious, which I found completely and utterly ridiculous. But I guess thinking about it in this point, Ray enjoys watching the movies, or did enjoy watching the movies, because it reminded him of where he was when he made them. And that arguably is sort of, you know, maybe doing it a little too much for yourself. But if you can't please yourself with what you're doing, how can you sell the idea to somebody else, is kind of the way I look at it. So if that was a way for him to do that, then so be it. And hats off to him to being inventive about this stuff, because I mean, there's some things that, and even in this film, there's a picture of Carolyn Brandt that pops up in the movie in a way that didn't entirely make sense, and that probably wouldn't have happened had they not been filming at their house. And it's one of those things you watch. It takes, I imagine that if you were to watch, and certainly some people can't even make their way through these movies one time, but if you watch these films over and over again, you end up picking up different things. And just like, really like any good movie, you'll end up doing that. Going back to this whole thing of shooting at the house, I mean, there's moments where I can remember in Rat Fink seeing the house being shot, like, it's almost like he stole the shot, and probably all it was is he just remembered, hey, this looked good in Rat Fink. Why don't I just grab this same establishing shot to use it in Body Fever? You know, and there's no crime in ripping off yourself. And sticking with the kind of homegrown approach to all this, most of the people involved in these films were simply family and friends. You know, certainly as we've already established the husband and wife aspect of all of this. So besides Ray and Carolyn, you have Ron Haydock, you have Herb Robbins, Gary Kent. Now, Herb Robbins apparently introduced him being Ray, to a lot of different people over time, but these connections were made, and these, once these people got into the movies with him and, he liked their work, he was tried to be a real fighter for him. He really had hoped Ron Haydock would have became bigger than he was. And hearing the commentary on Body Fever, he certainly said that about Gary. And, Herb Robbins became known for other things, but also remained friends with Ray over the years. And one of the latter films of Ray's career was a film from the late 90s called Summer Fun, which was his attempt to make a family film kind of like the Lemon Grove Kids, but it plays a little more contemporary than that film, which is a throwback to the Bowery Boys and the Dead End Kids. Obviously, some people gone on the bigger and better things, and that trend seemed to, while it wasn't necessarily very successful for the actors in front of the camera, certainly behind the camera, Ray had a bit of better luck when it came to that. I already mentioned Laszlo Kovacs, Vilmos Zsigmond, which, if you're really interested in trying to find out a lot about them in a short period of time, there's a film called No Subtitles Necessary, which is a documentary, deals with their beginnings and, how they went on. Vilmos Zsigmond ended up being cinematographer on Close Encounters Third Kind, ended up winning an Academy Award for that. Laszlo Kovacs, if I remember right, ended up doing a lot of, I think he was, did the cinematography of The Last Picture Show. I seem to remember more of Zygmos' work. A film that I would eventually like to talk about later on, from the 90s called Playing by Heart, was cinematography was done by him. And actually, now I think about it, I think weird pull that I want to bring here, don't ask, but I believe Laszlo Kovacs did the cinematography on the original Miss Congeniality. So that, they became established in the 60s and, carried on throughout their careers. Both of them have a very long list of credits. But besides them, there were people behind the scenes going back to Ratfink and leading into this film that ended up going on to bigger and better things. Keith Wester is the one that I'm going to referring to both films. Ratfink and Boo Boo was actually shot as a silent film, as I think most of, if not all of, Body Fever as well. There's some that seem to suggest that maybe they had a little extra money, managed to record some audio on set, but for the most part, Ray shot his films as silent films, and with Ratfink, what became the job for Keith Wester was to lay down every single sound effect on that movie. So basically anything that wasn't score, anything that was dialogue that needed to be recorded, that fell on him. For Body Fever, besides having a small cameo in it, he was actually responsible for some of the cinematography in the film as well. And since those humble beginnings and before his death in the early 2000s, he ended up becoming known as a sound mixer extraordinaire. And he ended up getting nominated for 6 Academy Awards for a few films that you've probably heard of, unlike the one we're discussing right now. Those 6 movies were Black Rain, Waterworld, The Rock, Air Force One, Armageddon, and The Perfect Storm. He also did Thelma and Louise and one of my personal favorites, Joe versus the Volcano. So for Body Fever, he was more involved in the camera department, and he also was basically a production partner with Steckler for this film. It was a Steckler-Wester production. And 2 other people that were involved with the camera side of this movie ended up going on to some bigger and better things. Jack Cooperman who did, and he seems to be very specialized as far as his cinematography. He's done a lot of underwater and aerial work, but his work could be found in staying slightly more B-movie with this first pick. But he was worked on Alligator, and then he ended up doing Joe Dante's Explorers and Top Gun and the fourth Star Trek movie, as well as Big Trouble in Little China. And then the last person of note with the cinematography, and I think I remember this from the commentary, Ray made it sound like there were only a couple of scenes that he was involved with. Keith Wester, Jack Cooperman did most of the cinematography in this film. But Gil Hubbs ended up going on to becoming a DP. He was a DP, director of photography, for the Bruce Lee film Enter the Dragon, and he ended up being the cinematographer for what appeared to be most, if not the entire run of the TV series Murphy Brown. So just a few nuggets of trivia there as far as that goes. And I think on that note, I'm going to wrap up this segment, and then we'll come back with some final thoughts and a little something else about Ray Dennis Steckler that you guys might not be aware of, and some coming attractions. So stay tuned. This is Flickering Waves. This is Terry. We'll be right back. And we're back to Flickering Waves, and we're wrapping up the discussion of the 1969 Ray Dennis Steckler film, Body Fever. Just to wrap up, as I said on the last podcast, I'm not really going to sit here and do ratings and stars or anything like that. I think it's easier to find now, and with that, I think if you're looking for something a little out of the ordinary, I think it's definitely worth your time. If you happen to like this particular film, I've certainly mentioned many of the other films that Ray did, and I would definitely say the 60s output is, if there's such a thing as the essential Ray Dennis Steckler catalog, that's where most of it is. The stuff that's later on gets a little darker. The violence is still relatively low key by, you compare it to films of its contemporary, but they do get darker enough, and they get a little less fun. Certainly something like Summer Fun ends up being more of a throwback to these earlier films, but if you want the good stuff, to me, any movie that's got a 6 in the year release, with maybe the exception of Cynthia the Devil Doll, I'd say you're pretty much in for a good 70 to 80 minutes of entertainment, or at least something that will get you talking. So that's my take on it. As I mentioned earlier, Pandora is the streaming option. They're very cheaply available on most websites. There's a couple of box sets that are out, which actually Body Fever is in the Midnight Movies Volume 2 box set. The rest of those titles are some of the other ones that I was trying to warn you away from. If you want the other ones I was just talking about, Rat Fink, Incredibly Strange, those are in the Volume 1 box set, but, do a little research. You might be pleasantly surprised how cheaply you can get off for one evening's worth of entertainment. So, and I think in all this, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Ray up at some point during this podcast is, more I've thought about it, the commentaries that are on these films aren't always the best. There's sometimes where he will sit there and fall into just describing what's on the screen, and that can be a little frustrating, especially as someone who's seen the movies as many times as I have. But one of the things that I always enjoyed about him, whether it was scene interviews, documentaries, I have 3 hours of audio that he ended up doing with some film critic out in Los Angeles, if memory serves me right. the man could tell a story, and he definitely had a realm of interest. I mean, part of it simply due to the fact that he's from a different time, me and certainly people of my age, that he had a very good way of selling those things, in so much as it would make me want to seek them out or at least research them a little bit. And some of those things I probably still haven't given proper credit to, as far as going to the trouble of researching them. Ray was a huge fan of Westerns as well. And I, being someone who came into that genre very late, probably hasn't gone back and looked at some of the stuff that he was a fan of. But I think this is a very long, roundabout sort of way of saying that I think if he could have made it to the age of podcasting and someone would have given him just the right push, I think, and this, now I'm feeling like one of the first things that I saw about him was the Incredibly Strange Film Show, which I believe I mentioned earlier. If not, that name will be coming up again in future episodes of the podcast. But very early on in the documentary about him on that show, they cut to where they're interviewing Carolyn Brandt, and this was even after they'd gotten divorced. She made a comment that I always imagined there'd be the day where he'd be going and accepting an Academy Award. And I kind of feel like that mindset as I say this next thing, which is, I think if he could have made it to the age of podcasting, I think he would have, with the right go-to person, just someone to be able to talk to or set him up, however you want to do it, I think he would have had some very interesting stories. As I was saying before, he definitely had his unique set of interests and things that he knew about in a way that other people didn't know about him, or certainly unique perspective. Because I know he got slighted for this, and I can see both sides of the argument, but he's one of the few people that I can think of that would actually go and talk about the merits, not trying to knock him down a peg, not, oh, we like him, but when I'm thinking of this, Ed Wood Jr., he was someone who was kind of a fan, not necessarily of the stuff that most of us think of, but other work that he did, and, saw him as a director of merit. So that's certainly not something that you would hear every day. And it's little things like that I think if he had the opportunity to do that now, it would have been some interesting stories to hear. And, just talking to him over the phone the few times I got to do that, he was a very nice, ultimately a nice guy in my interactions with them. I've heard some other stories, but, those are those people's stories. I have mine. He's definitely somebody that I wish was still around making movies. He was getting a bit more prolific in his latter years. He didn't call it I think he called it an extension as opposed to a sequel, but he did this movie called One More Time, which I didn't get a chance to get a hold of it before he passed. And recently I managed to stumble upon it on YouTube. Not proud of the fact, but I did sit down and give it a watch. And if everything settles down to where I can find a way of getting a legitimate copy of it, I definitely would like to get it, because it very neatly and very strangely, and in a way only Ray Dennis Steckler could do it, he directly takes clips from Incredibly Strange Creatures, but then everything else that he does with it, he manages to somehow tie up every little detour that his career took, minus the porno period, which those films are not under his name. They're under pseudonyms, but he had to do what he had to do at the time. And the films are out there. You can go online, research it, and everything else. It is what it is. I don't consider that part of the official filmography, but it is stuff that he worked on. And the fact that he didn't put his name on it clearly means that he was trying to distance himself from it. And I respect that. To hear some of the stories, even making these films that he put his name on, doing them for, he basically would get $20, and sometimes it would be a question of, do I go out and shoot, buy a roll of film and shoot it, or do the kids eat this week? And that question didn't always get the same answer each time. Sometimes it was, and a lot of the films post Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living Became Mixed Up Zombies were of that. He got $20. He got a couple days. He'd do stuff. 5 months might pass by. He'd have opportunity to do it again. That would probably explain some of the observable faults that people find in these movies. For me, I increasingly find them endearing over time. But that's enough of me trying to explain my like of this film and the films of Ray Dennis Steckler. For now, we'll come back to this some point down the line. One thing I did want to mention, and it's thanks to the Facebook page. There was actually a Facebook page for Ray at some point, but that disappeared, and now somebody put one up for Ray Dennis Steckler Lives. And I found that, and they were nice enough to, or somebody from the site was nice enough to throw up that Forgotten Flicks essay that I mentioned at the beginning of this. And then somebody started to inquire about Ray Dennis Steckler, music video director. And at that point, a little light bulb went off in my head. I ran over and got my DVD copy of Steckler Mania Volume 2. And sure enough, the memory got together, and I found a few of the videos. The main one that I would say just about anybody would be interested in is the one that was being inquired about on the Facebook page, and that is his version of Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit. Now, I don't remember seeing this particular video growing up. The one I remember seeing was more of a performance clip. This is definitely conceptual in design, and features Carolyn Brandt, again, as being photographed and directed by Ray Dennis Steckler. It's definitely feels of the period, but I certainly enjoy it. I'm glad it's out there. I found it really weird that when I found it on YouTube that it was actually from VH1 Classic. So that would imply that some people are seeing this in a more contemporary setting. Now, granted, I imagine they probably, and I don't remember seeing it on there. Certainly there was a day when they would put director's credits on music videos, but I don't think they put it on there for reasons, who knows. There are a few other videos that he was involved with. It's certainly not complete. Certainly the clip that I'm most curious about at this point. Supposedly he shot some footage of Jimi Hendrix, but and certainly if that is true, that footage would probably trump what I'm going to bring up, but that I'm not as certain of as this other thing, which is footage of Janis Joplin that he apparently shot supposedly around when they were on downtime from his involvement with ABC Wide World Sports. That may have been the show The Professionals, which Ray references in the commentary for Body Fever, but that I'm not 100% sure of. But supposedly there's some footage that he shot, concert footage, of Janis Joplin playing live. Certainly would be curious to see what that was like, if that footage is even around at this point. Might be in the ABC's television vault. I'm not sure. Just little things to chew on there. But rather than me going on about the other ones, it's probably going to be 2, maybe 3 other videos. I'm going to see if I can find one more that Ray was involved with. So if you guys are listening to this and you want to go to our YouTube page, that's going to be there, as well as probably just a few clips for this particular episode. Body Fever itself is, to my knowledge, not available on YouTube, so I don't have clips to grab from or anything like that. So most of the stuff that is going to be on the YouTube playlist for this episode are going to be things that I reference off little side tangent type things. So I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. But before we do, I'm going to go ahead and cut it to another gentleman who probably has a familiar voice to give you guys some details on how you can take part in this podcast. So take it away. To download episodes of the podcast, go to flickeringwaves.com or go to iTunes and search for Flickering Waves. While there, you can subscribe to the podcast as well as leave comments and reviews. We look forward to any comments you may have about the podcast, and we look forward to any 5-star reviews that you'd like to give us. If you simply like to send a comment, you can go to flickeringwaves@gmail.com. Send us an email with comments and or suggestions. If you're into social media, we're available on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Flickering Waves on Facebook, and we're at Flickering Waves on Twitter. Through both, we like to put up additional supplemental materials, most of them supplied through YouTube, which we have a channel there that we're slowly building up, so feel free to look for us over there as well. Flickering Waves. All right, so now to finally wrap it up, I want to go ahead and give you guys some thoughts of coming attractions. This technically should be the second podcast for the month of July, since there's 3 Tuesdays in the month of July this year. Going to try to squeeze in one more podcast before the end of the month. It's going to be episode 7. I don't have an official title for it yet, but it's going to attempt to pick up a podcast that I abandoned last summer about my trip to Nashville to see She and Him. And I'm going to try to wrap into it the 2 concerts that I got to see of M. Ward now that he finally came to Florida earlier this year. And somewhere in there, it's just going to be basically a Zooey Deschanel M. Ward love fest. So for those of you who've been wondering what that would sound like, you're going to soon find out as I try to revisit those waters once again. So that will be episode 7. And the episodes for August, as of right now, we're going to completely throw our weight back to music for the month of August. Going to be discussion of 2 albums, Ryan Adams' Love is Hell and Jeff Buckley's Grace, which will be celebrating its 20th anniversary come August. And I feel the gray hairs just pushing through my skull right now. So with that, that's what the next 4 to 6 weeks are looking like. Thinking ahead to 2015, because I think it's going to take me a little bit of time to map this out, I would like to do what will mostly be a reoccurring segment, but perhaps depending on some of the things that I pick, whole episodes might grow out of this. But one of the things that I enjoyed doing when I was a little bit younger was sitting down with some friends, and I know of some people who are still able to do this, and more power to you if you can do it. But sitting down and having a movie night, and I kind of want to take a page from that. I want to take a page from the drive-ins down here that you used to do from dusk till dawn type events, and take a page from the idea of film festivals. And what I want to try to do over the course of 2015 is, once I figure out how much time that I have, that I'm going to allow myself to play with this, as far as how long is the evening, the from dusk till dawn period is going to be. I'm going to try to put together, and if this goes, maybe it'll, we'll do more than one 2015, but what I think I'm going to try to do is I'm going to put together a whole evening, if you will. Rigidly timed, things put together with other things on purpose. Try to think about short films as well as feature-length films, cartoons, documentaries, you name it. Probably what's going to happen is I will figure out one movie that I want to build everything else around, and I'm going to try it out. So that's one reason why I think it will take the rest of this year to get a couple of those ideas fleshed out, and then I will talk about them at length. Obviously, some of these things won't take as long as other things. We'll get a feel for it as we go, but that's something that just popped in my head earlier today that I think would be a lot of fun, especially since I'm to the point now. Last time I tried to do something like that was with my friend Vic. When I was younger, we could do all-nighters like that, throw in some stand-up comedy specials and make a whole evening of it. But, the last few times we did it, we'd get one movie in, two movies in, and one of us would be trying to keep the other person awake. It just, took all the fun out of it. So this hopefully will be a nice throwback to that. And if you were listening earlier and you have any thoughts on that yourself, email, Facebook, Twitter, all that good stuff, check us out. So if you've made it this far, you've definitely been checking us out for a little while now, and I certainly appreciate it. And thank you very much for listening. This is Terry. This is Flickering Waves, episode 6, Femme Fatale. We're signing off now. Thank you very much for listening. Take care. Thanks to Paul Van Doors for the intro, outro, and transitional music featured in this podcast.